Well, wouldn't it be nice if in life we had an easy button? Y'all know what I'm talking about, the easy button? The easy button made its debut in the Super Bowl commercial way back in 2005. And this was a Staples commercial, and I don't know if y'all remember the commercial for the easy button. You got different scenarios in life that they throw out. You've got the kid in school who's not paying attention, and then the teacher calls on him to answer a question. He's like, I don't know, hit the easy button. And then they show a dad that's trying to change, he has twin boys, and he's trying to change their diapers, and he's like, what do I do? This is ridiculous, and he hits the easy button. And then you have a doctor or a surgeon who's about to perform surgery, and the nurse looks at him and says, well, you've never performed this surgery before. He's like, that's okay. And he hits the easy button, right? And so they end the commercial by asking this question is, wouldn't it be nice if life had an easy button? Wouldn't that be nice if there was one for life? And obviously there's not. And so as you live life and as you get older, when you're a kid, everything's great, right? But as you get older, you begin to realize that life isn't always easy. Life is often tough. And there are so many things that just show up in our life that just make life difficult. And when you become a Christian, when you become a believer, many people believe, or they're under the impression that life is just going to become so much easier when you become a Christian. Well, that's not always true. Now, true, you should be full of joy, and so in that way, life may be easier because you're full of joy, and you're full of the joy of the Lord and your salvation and these things. But oftentimes, as a Christian, our life can become even harder than it is before, and that is because we have an enemy that seeks to keep us from following God's will. And so listen to what Paul tells us in Ephesians 6:12. He says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this darkness, against evil spiritual forces in the heavens. And so he says our struggle, because life isn't easy, right? Life is difficult. So we have a struggle, but he wants us to know our struggle isn't against people. Although from our eyes, it often feels that way, that people are our enemies. Some people are against us. They oppose us. And so oftentimes we can see people as our enemies. But Paul wants us to know that really people aren't our enemies. That the enemy really is who? It is Satan, his demons, the spiritual forces that are at work. And they are at work to thwart God's plan. And so here's what happens. As you become a child of God, you get saved, you become a Christian, Paul tells us that we are transferred from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of the Son. And when that happens, we automatically have a target that is put on our back. And all of a sudden, the forces of evil, they begin to attack. And so oftentimes, life doesn't get easier. Oftentimes it gets harder because all of a sudden we're living our life for the Lord, and they want to thwart God's plan in our life. And so as we begin to seek out to do God's will, and we want to do this because we believe God is leading us to do that, or we want to go in this direction because God's leading us to do that, we can begin to expect that we're going to have some opposition in our life because the enemy doesn't want us to follow God's plan. He wants to thwart God's plan in our life. And so we can bet that we're going to have some opposition. And so this brings us to Nehemiah, because if you're reading along, you're keeping track of the book of Nehemiah and this incredible story that's in the Old Testament. They have encountered some opposition. And today we're going to read about how they encounter even more opposition from our antagonist of the story, the bad guy, Sanballat and his crew. And so he's going to need to persevere. He's going to need to display perseverance. If they are going to keep going, they're going to do exactly what God has called them to do, to rebuild the wall, to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. So if you have your Bible with you, go ahead and turn to Nehemiah chapter 4. We'll be there in a minute. If you don't, we'll have the words on the screen as usual. But Nehemiah was the cupbearer for the King Artaxerxes in Persia. And he was visited by his brother, and his brother came with some bad news. That the walls of Jerusalem, they were still torn down. The gates had been torn down. And even though it was possible for all of the Israelites to go back to Jerusalem, even almost 100 years ago, the city was still in ruins. The city was still a disgrace, and the enemies of Israel were still running in and stealing and killing and taking all their food and their money and just not allowing the city to be rebuilt. And so immediately, this burdened the heart of Nehemiah. In fact, he was heartbroken. It says he mourned. For 4 months he mourned and he prayed, God, give me an opportunity to speak to the king about these issues. And finally, after 4 months, the king recognizes that he's sad, and he's like, what's going on? This is sadness of heart. You're not sick. What's going on? And so Nehemiah tells him, hey, look, this is the state of the city of Jerusalem. And even though he had given a decree several years ago to stop the building of Jerusalem, he's asking him, King Artaxerxes, will you reverse that? Will you allow me to go and to rebuild the city? And so the king's granted his request. God's hand was upon him, and he was able to go with letters to gather supplies, and he was able to go back to the city with the blessings of the king to rebuild the city. And so he's able to rally the troops, and everybody's excited. Nehemiah's there with the officials of the king, and they've got all these supplies. And finally, after almost 100 years of trying to rebuild the city, there's some hope that they're going to rebuild this city, and they begin to build. And that's what we talked about last week, is how they began to build. And they had a strategic plan. Nehemiah had a plan to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And one of the key focal points was the gates. The gates were important to the people of Israel. And so we talked about how they stationed strategic people for those gates to rebuild the gates, and that kind of surrounded the city. And then they just got people to kind of fill in the gaps. And basically they got everyone involved. And this was one of the strategies that they said was, we need everybody involved. And so if you didn't have a specific thing to do, they're just like, hey, look, you just rebuild the wall right in front of your house. And so it didn't matter who you are or where you lived, you had a part to play, a role to play in rebuilding the wall. And so this is kind of where Nehemiah chapter 4 picks up. They're rebuilding the wall, and they're starting to make some progress, and it's becoming evident to Sanballat, Tobias, Geshem, and all of the enemies of Israel. They begin to see, hey, they are rebuilding the wall. And so in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became furious. He mocked the Jews before his colleagues and the powerful men of Samaria and said, what are these pathetic Jews doing? Can they restore it themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they ever finish it? Can they bring these burnt stones back to life from the mounds of rubble? Then Tobiah, the Ammonite, who was beside him, said, indeed, even if a fox climbed up on what they are building, he would break down their stone wall. So let's pause there for a second. All right, so here we see Sanballat, Tobiah, they begin mocking. They begin attacking Nehemiah and the Jews for rebuilding the wall. They are not happy at all that the walls are going up. I mean, they love raiding the city, and they love taking and stealing from them. And so now they're not going to be able to do that if the walls are built. And so they're upset. And so what we need to realize, and what Nehemiah realized, is that attacks from the enemies are often meant to discourage you from doing God's will. When the attacks come, they often start in the form of mocking and discouraging. And that's really their goal, is they want to discourage you from doing whatever it is that God has called you to do. And the applications of this are many and may change throughout our life. Whatever we're doing, we're going to see opposition. And oftentimes it comes, their intention is to keep you, to discourage you from doing that which God has called you. And so one of the surest ways to know that you are moving in the right direction is if Satan and his enemies are opposing you. So D.L. Moody, one day he was given a sermon about this, about how the enemy is going to oppose our work for the Lord. And so he began to go on and share several stories about how the enemy had opposed his ministry. And afterwards, another minister, fellow preacher, was in the crowd, and he came up to him afterwards, and he's like, I can't believe all these stories you shared. It's funny. We haven't experienced anything like that at our church and in my ministry. And D.L. Moody said this to him. He said, sir, the reason you never meet the devil coming against you in your work may be because you are both going in the same direction. And so think about that. If we are doing God's work, we know that the enemy is going to come and they're going to try to discourage us. They're going to try to attack us to keep us from doing God's will. And so we need to know that from the very beginning, that we don't need to be surprised when opposition comes. We don't need to be caught off guard. 1 Peter 5:8 says, be sober-minded, be alert. Your adversary, the devil, is prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for anyone he can devour. And so this is kind of their first step, their first tactic is to see, okay, can we mock you? Can we do some things to discourage you, to keep you from doing God's will? And so when the enemy comes with their verbal taunts, it usually comes in three ways. One is mocking, making fun of you, picking on you, because you're doing what you believe God's called you to do. And this can come, like I said, in a variety of forms. They also bring up past failures. They want to remind you, hey, you remember when you did this and you failed? Well, it's going to happen again. So they're going to bring up your past. They're going to bring up your past failures to see if they can use that to discourage you. And they're also going to be very critical with their words. They're going to be harsh. You ever feel like somebody's just analyzed you, sliced and diced you, with just their words? And so this is what happens. The enemy will come in and he will use these methods of verbal taunting to try to discourage us from doing God's will. So Nehemiah and the Jews, they're facing these verbal taunts from Sanballat and Tobiah and others. So how do they respond? Do they give in or do they keep going? Well, verse 4 says, listen, our God, for we are despised, making their insults return on their own heads, and let them be taken as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their guilt or let their sin be erased from your sight, because they have angered the builders. So we rebuilt the wall until the entire wall was joined up together, up to half its height, for the people had the will to keep working. All right, so how did Nehemiah respond to the verbal taunts of the enemy? He immediately goes to the Lord in prayer. Why does he do that? Because he knows that God is with him. And so when we face opposition from the enemy, we need to keep going. Why? Because we know that God is with us. God is with us and he will walk with us and he will see us through whatever it is he has called us to do, whatever his will is. And this, like I said, could come in a variety of ways. There is an interesting story that I just want to share briefly with you, found in the book of Exodus. And this happens right after the golden cow. Y'all know the golden cow incident. Moses is up on the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments. He comes down. And during that time, the Israelites, they've turned from God and they began worshiping this golden cow that they made, right? And so it's right after that. God's angry. And God basically says, Moses, I'm going to wipe out all of these people. He says, I'm going to wipe them all out. I'm going to kill them all. And I'm just going to start over with you and your family. And Moses pleads with them and is like, please, God, please, no, don't do that. Don't do that. I know they're stubborn. I know they're a stiff-necked people. That's kind of the phrase he used. They're just stubborn. But please don't do that. And he said, in fact, I would rather switch places with them. Please just, don't wipe them out. And then God's like, okay, all right, fine. Because of you, I will not wipe them out. However, when they go to the promised land, the land that I've promised them, I'm not going to go with them. I'll provide protection and stuff for them to make sure everybody gets there okay, but I'm not going to go with you. And God has been traveling with them by a pillar of fire, pillar of cloud. Y'all may remember the story from the Old Testament. And he's like, I'm not going to go with you anymore. And this is where Moses picks up in Exodus 33, verse 15 and 16. This is his plea to God. And what he says, I think, is absolutely profound. Verse 15, he says, if your presence does not go, Moses responded to him, don't make us go up from here. How will it be known that I and your people have found favor with you unless you go with us? I and your people will be distinguished by this from all other people on the face of the earth. So this is what Moses is saying. He says, listen, if you're not going to go with us, God, then we might as well just stay here. Because this is what makes us distinct from anybody else in the world, is that you are with us, that your presence is with us. So if your presence doesn't go with us, then we're just going to stay here in the desert. We're not going to go to the promised land. We're going to stay with you. Wherever you are, that's where we're going to go, is basically what Moses is saying. And I just think it's very profound, and I think it is true today for all of us to know that God is with us. The Holy Spirit lives and dwells inside of us, and still, just like Moses said, this is what makes us distinct amongst the people of the world, is that God is with us. And so when God starts something in us, and He leads us, and He's guiding us to do something in our life, He will be with us to help us, to give us the strength that we need to be able to persevere, to be able to get through it. He will walk with us through whatever opposition may come from our enemy. And this is exactly what we see Nehemiah and the Jewish people doing. They kept going. Even though the verbal taunts were coming, the insults were coming, the mocking was coming, the reminders of all their past failures to be able to rebuild the wall were being reminded to them. They kept building, and now they're starting to see some success. Now they're starting to see some progress. The wall is now halfway tall. They're making some progress. And what does Nehemiah say? The people had the will to continue. The people had the will to continue. Why? Because they knew that God was with them. They did not quit. They did not give up. They knew that God was with them. And we can do the same thing. When we believe that God is leading us to do something, we don't quit, we don't give up, because we know that God is with us and He will walk with us and through us through whatever is going on. But Sanballat, he's not going to give up that easy. In fact, he begins to take it up a notch. Verse 7, when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair to the walls of Jerusalem was progressing and that the gaps were being closed, they became furious. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to throw it into confusion. So we prayed to our God and stationed a guard because of them, day and night. In Judah, it was said, the strength of the laborer fails, since there is so much rubble. We will never be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, they won't realize it until we're among them and can kill them and stop the work. When the Jews who lived nearby arrived, they said to us time and time again, everywhere you turn, they attack us. All right, so now Sanballat and his enemies, they begin to attack, and they take it up a notch. Now they are physically attacking the Jewish people. So first it was taunting, and when that didn't discourage them, they go to the next step of violence. And so what we see and what we know is that the enemy comes to what? Steal, kill, and destroy. That's what Jesus told us, and it's true, and we can see it throughout the entire Bible, is that the enemy wants to thwart God's plan. If he can't discourage us, then he might even choose to take the next step and to steal, kill, and destroy. And this is what we see Sanballat doing. This is what has happened, is Sanballat has gone, and basically everybody that is listed in this list, Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, the Ashdodites, all of them. Basically, if you were to look at a map of where they lived, it's basically north, south, east, and west. They are surrounded by enemies, much like they are today. Not a whole lot has changed, in a little over, about 2,500 years. Not much has changed. Israel was surrounded by enemies in Nehemiah. They're surrounded by enemies today. And so Sanballat's kind of the ringleader. And so he gets all of their enemies together, and they surround the city, and they begin to attack. And so part of their plan is to exploit the weaknesses of the wall. And right now, the weaknesses of the city is the rubble that has been torn down from the past wall. It's still there. And so they use that to kind of hide behind. And then when the moment's right, they would jump out and they would attack and they would kill or they would steal, whatever their plan was. So they would use the weaknesses in the city to attack. And this is something that the enemy will do to us, is that they will look for our weaknesses. And when they know and they find out what your weaknesses are, that's where they will attack. And they will know when you are spiritually weak. We all go through peaks and valleys, right? There are times when we have a spiritual high. There are times when we're having a spiritual low. And when we're at those lows, oftentimes that's when the enemy chooses to attack. They're waiting, they're watching, and then they will spring into action. And this is exactly what we're seeing. But also part of their goal was to cause confusion. Because they had surrounded the city of Jerusalem, they didn't all attack at one time. Sometimes they would attack at the bottom, then at the top, then at the sides, and so they never knew where the attacks were coming from. So this causes fear, this causes terror and confusion, and this is exactly what they are wanting to do. And if you watch very closely, I don't know how much you watch in the news, but when you watch in the news exactly how the enemies of Israel today, how they attack, this is exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to cause fear, they're trying to cause terror, and they're trying to cause confusion. And they're trying to surround Israel, which they have done. And if you keep up with the news, they're attacking and they're fighting literally on every front of Israel. And so this is the same thing that's happening to Nehemiah and the Jews in his day. They are literally surrounded, and so they're facing attacks from all directions. It is a 360 attack. And they never know at any moment which direction the attack is going to come from. So they are surrounded. So how do they respond? Verse 13. So I stationed people behind the lowest sections of the wall at the vulnerable areas. I stationed them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I made an inspection, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the great and awe-inspiring Lord, and fight for our countrymen, your sons and daughters, your wives and your homes. When our enemies heard that we knew their scheme and that God had frustrated it, every one of us returned to his own work on the wall. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half held spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers supported all the people of Judah who were rebuilding the wall. The laborers who carried the loads worked with one hand and held a weapon with the other. Each of the builders had his own sword strapped to his waist. And while he was building, and with the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is enormous and spread out, and we are separated far from one another along the wall. Whoever you hear sound the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we continued the work, while half of the men were holding spears from daybreak until the stars came out. At that time, I also said to the people, let everyone and his servants spend the night inside Jerusalem, so that they can stand guard by night and work by day. And I, my brothers, my servants, and the men of the guard with me never took off our clothes. Each carried his weapon, even when washing. All right, so this is very incredible moment. So they decide, all right, we've got to make some adjustments. We're being attacked on all fronts. It's a 360 attack. We've got to change what we're doing. We've got to make some adjustments. So this is what they decide. They decide, all right, we're going to take half the men. And so basically, according to the research that I've been able to find, some scholars believe that there were as many as 10,000 men working on the wall around the whole city. And remember, they're building it all at one time, right? They didn't start at one point and kind of like dominoes go around. They're building it all up, all sections, all at the same time. And so if you have 10,000 men working, so now you have 5,000 who now are guards. So they've got their shields, they've got their swords, they've got their spears and their bows and whatever they need to be guards. And they're spread out throughout the whole city, throughout the whole walls. And so now you've got the other half, approximately 5,000, who are working. Now, how are they working? In one hand, they have a sword. But in the other hand, they're building the wall. I don't know exactly how efficient that is, but this is what they're doing. So at all points, at any point in time, there's an attack. You have about 10,000 men who are ready to rally to the trumpet to go and to fight. Now, that's a pretty good army. I don't know how well trained they are, but that's pretty decent for back in this day and this time and what's going on. So you got about 10,000 people that are ready to fight at any point in time. And so they are ready to fight. And so they've got to make adjustments. And so they're going to continue on. They're not going to stop. And notice that Nehemiah even says that they didn't even take their clothes off to wash. They just kept doing exactly what God called them to do, to rebuild the wall. They didn't stop. They didn't give in. They didn't pause. They kept going. Yes, they had to make some adjustments, but they kept going. They didn't even, when they went to take a bath, it's like, all right, pull up your leg, wash your leg, pull up your shirt, wash your belly. But we got this sword right here because you just never know when they're going to attack. And obviously, if you're taking a bath, you're very vulnerable in that moment. So they were on watch all the time. And so they were very aware of the enemy, but they kept going. They did not stop. They kept pushing through. And this was a great display of perseverance of Nehemiah and the people of Israel, the Jewish people. And so perseverance, it literally means just to continue in a course of action in spite of opposition. They kept going. They did not stop. And so for you and I, whatever it is that God has called us to do, we need to keep going. We don't need to stop. We need to show perseverance, and we need to keep going despite the opposition from the enemy. So I just want to give you just some 3 quick keys to persevering. And the first one is this, is that we need to expect adversity when you're in the middle of God's will. We need to expect it. In John chapter 15 and verse 18, it says, if the world hates you, understand that it hated me before it hated you. And this is the words of Jesus. If you were of the world would love you as its own. However, because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of it, the world hates you. Remember the word I spoke to you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will also keep yours. But they will do all these things to you on account of my name, because they don't know the one who sent me. All right, so Jesus warns us in advance that if you are a child of God and you are actively walking in the will of God and you're doing what He has called you to do, you are going to face persecution. You're going to face opposition. So don't be surprised when it happens. Don't be surprised when it comes. Don't be caught off guard. Don't be caught flat-footed, but expect it. Be ready for it, because it is going to come in some form or fashion. And so Jesus is basically like, look, it happened to me. It's going to happen to you, because this is what has happened. When you become a child of God, when you become a follower of Jesus, you've been transferred from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of the Son, the kingdom of Jesus, Jesus' kingdom. So now you are an enemy of the world, the spiritual forces. And so they will eventually at some point come after you. Now, if you're not following God's will, you're not doing what He wants in your life, you're not trying to draw close to the Lord, then you're probably not going to face much opposition. But if you are growing in your walk in the Lord, you are growing and you are trying to follow Him and you want your life to bring Him glory and honor with everything that you do, you can expect there's going to be some pushback. You can expect some opposition. So we need to be ready for that. We don't need to be caught off guard. And Nehemiah absolutely was ready, and he had a plan, and he was able to quickly adapt to what the enemy was able to do so that he can keep going and building the wall. The second key is this, is that perseverance requires dependence on Christ's strength. It is not something that we can do on our own, but we need God's strength. Y'all know Philippians 4:13? It says, I am able to do all things through Him who strengthens me. And he's talking about Christ. This is Paul. And when Paul writes this, he is sitting in a jail. He's in jail, he's in prison, and he's writing about how he has found a way to be content in any circumstance. Even though he's sitting in jail, and he's like, listen, I can do anything that Christ gives me the strength to do. And so when God calls us to do something, He will give us the strength to help us complete that task, complete whatever it is that He has called us to do. And He will give it to us. But we have to realize that it's His strength that we need, and we need to be dependent upon Him, dependent upon His strength. We need to draw from His strength because He lives and He dwells inside of us, because we're going to face, attacks from all sides, even maybe sides that we don't anticipate, and we never thought we'd be attacked in this way. It's going to happen. It's what the enemy does. We may face a 360 attack. And you may want to quit. You may want to give up. But we have to know that if God's called us to do something, He's going to give us the strength to be able to finish it. And that's the third key, is that we must believe that perseverance will be worth it at the end. We must believe that perseverance is worth it at the end. It's very clear that Nehemiah, The Jewish people, they believe that rebuilding the wall is going to be worth it. No matter what Sanballat and his enemies do, no matter how they attack, no matter what damage they cause, they believe it's worth it to build the wall. It's worth it. Worth whatever suffering comes their way to rebuild the wall, because they know it's what God has called them to do. Listen to 1 Corinthians 15:58. Paul says, "Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the Lord's work, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." Did y'all hear that? He said, be steadfast, be immovable. Don't be moved by the enemy. Why? Because what you are doing is well worth it. You are not laboring in vain. Whatever it is that God has called you to do, whatever it is you're doing in your life that God has led you to do, don't give up. Don't be immovable. Be strong. Keep going. Don't give up, because your work is worth it. Your labor for the Lord is never in vain. Galatians 6:9, this is also Paul. "Let us not get tired of doing good, for we will reap at the proper time if we don't give up." We will reap. We will see the benefits. We will see the rewards of our efforts. We will see why it is that God has called us to do something specific. Why it is, we went and we did this. Maybe God called you to go to a specific college, or maybe God called you to go and to take a specific job, or to go and to talk to a specific person about a certain situation. I don't know what it is, but God leads us and directs us all the time to do certain things. And so the application to this is many. And it's something that we can apply over and over and over in our life to say, listen, if God is calling us to do something, whether small or big, we can keep going. We don't need to stop. In fact, if you think about planting a church, there's going to be opposition that comes. The enemy isn't going to like the fact that we're trying to start a new church in Walton County. There's going to be opposition. There's going to be pushback. I remember it was a year ago, last spring, I don't know, maybe March or April, and I was at a church planting banquet, and I was sitting at a table with a guy that started a church 6 years ago, and I think it was in Marietta. And they were meeting at a school for 6 years. They get a new principal to come in, and the new principal said, "Well, the church meeting here is a violation of the separation between church and state. Y'all can't meet here anymore." So they'd been there for 6 years, and in 2 months' notice, they had to find a new place to go to meet. And so he was telling me about that, and then it was just a few weeks later, we found out, this was a year and a half ago before we had started even meeting here, that Atha Road was getting a new principal. That the principal that was here that I had talked to, that had agreed to let us come in. So the principal that I had talked to about meeting here and that we had come to an agreement with, he left. And so I'm like, oh, well, maybe God was preparing us with this conversation that, man, we might have to find another place to meet before we even get started. And so thankfully they hired the assistant principal, and we met him, Patrick Meadows, last week, and so he's all in favor of us being here. But you just never know, and you always have to be prepared to know that opposition is going to come. Opposition is going to come against our church. Opposition is going to come against other churches. Opposition is going to come against other churches. Anytime we are doing something for the Lord, opposition at some point is going to come. And it's going to be true for you in your life. Whenever you're doing something for God, you can expect opposition to come. The enemy doesn't like it. He's going to try to find a way to discourage you, to thwart you, to keep you from fulfilling God's plan in your life. And so just like Nehemiah, we have to keep going. We don't give up, but we keep going. We persevere, because we know that God is going to be with us, and He's going to give us everything that we need to follow through and to do exactly what He has called us